Hi everyone, welcome to this last part of the course and a new way of learning. Just quickly as a recap, during block week 1 we looked at the position in the environment, and block week 2 we looked at approaches to environmental challenges. So just quickly to go over them. So we looked at what is environmental studies, some principles and concepts. Then we looked at some major environmental problems of our time. Here you will remember that we divided up into 6 groups, and we did those spot presentations on these 6 problems that we highlighted. Then we looked more into environmental society and why values are so important to bear in mind when it comes to environmental decision making. And here you will recall that we had that role play exercise where we looked at a major EIA process for the city of Cape Town, who is trying to establish an additional or a regional landfill site. And the process, the environmental authorization process, has taken the city over 20 years and there's still no end in sight. So what we did is we divided up into different stakeholder groups, and we acted out sort of a typical public meeting around these various values and what people prioritize around this development proposal. And then in part 2, block week 2 in March, we looked at some of these environmental challenges in more detail. So we looked at especially natural resource use coupled with resource economics and urban metabolism as a up and coming interesting tool that can be used to see how cities use natural resources with the aim to try and make the linear life cycle of a city more circular. And then we looked at climate change, where we looked at South Africa's response thus far, and a bit more in detail in the Western Cape and what the predictions are for the Western Cape going forward in terms of climate. And in this part here, the last part, we're going to drill down into the technical side of environmental management. So the nuts and bolts of the actual process. Again, it's split into 2 lectures. This is the first lecture, which will then be followed by a lecture on NEMA and EIAs, or environmental impact assessments. During this lecture, we're going to look at 4 parts or 4 topics. Firstly, we're going to look at key concepts around environmental management. We'll then look at a sort of a global outlook of how the environmental management evolved over the years since the late 1970s, and how it then came across to South Africa, and what our responses were to this new way of looking at the environment or managing the environment. And then lastly, we're going to look at the concept of integrated environmental management. I've listed the 3 pre-readings here, which is also on Blackboard. Please first read these articles before you dive straight into the lecture slides. To quickly recap, in previous lectures we identified key environmental challenges of our time, which include natural resource use, pollution, loss of biodiversity, population and urbanization, climate change and global warming, and industrial disasters. We then looked at 2 of these in a lot more detail, which was natural resource use and resource economics, and then climate change. This section, or this part of the course, we will focus on how we protect and manage the impact of humans on the environment. You might recall from our first lecture that we looked at exactly this. What is environmental management? And we stated that the main objective of environmental management is the regulation of the effects of people's activities, products, and services on the environment. I've just included here a little screenshot of that first lecture where you can see where we touched on this, where we say one key task of it is to reduce the human vulnerability and improve adaptability. Environmental management is a concept that has evolved quickly over a short period of time. It emerged or originated with the rise of the modern environmental movement that started during the 1960s and 70s in the global north, which followed the post-World War II growth era. You'll remember that we touched on this modern environmental movement in quite some detail during lecture slides 1, when we looked at some of the key people that spearheaded this movement. For example, Rachel Carson and her book called The Silent Spring. When we look at the definition of this concept, we can obviously break it into two parts, environment and management. But for the environment, there's no definitive definition. Nalan Kutzer argues that it can either be viewed from a green viewpoint, which is from a natural sciences point of view, looking at living and non-living elements of Earth, or a viewpoint that incorporates social issues, the brown issues, with the purely green issues. So if we look closely at this green perspective, it only really focuses on biotic living or abiotic non-living, the elements of the ecosystem, such as, for example, how energy moves through ecosystems, the recycling of matter within a closed system, and also look at topics such as environmental degradation, protection of threatened species, etc. But it is a bit devoid of the social context. A typical definition from a green viewpoint could read as follows. The environment is the complex of biotic, climatic, soil, and other conditions which comprise the immediate habitat of an organism, the physical, chemical, and biological surroundings of an organism at any time. When we look at the brown perspective on environment, proponents of this view maintain that humans are central to this Earth system. Right, we're also organisms. Thus, the social issues cannot be separated from the environment. Such issues include production and consumption, unequal access to resources, poverty, crime, environmental injustice, spiritual value towards nature, etc. These are elements and issues that is only applicable to humans and not to other living organisms. So then, as far as environmental law is concerned, Null and Kutzer argue that the term environment should be considered as broad as possible to talk to both the green and the brown issues. To continue, the Deming management model is a model that's broadly used by the environmental community, and it stipulates that any management process should involve planning, doing, checking, and acting. Right. So thus, the environmental management could then involve planning, doing, checking, and acting activities of managers and governing agents as they relate to either the green environment or combinations of green and brown environmental elements. And this is according to Null and Kutzer. When we look at how environmental management as a concept evolved globally, we cast our eye to the global north over 3 distinct decades. So during the first decade, from 1970 to 1980, it was initiated with the USA publishing their National Environmental Policy Act of 1970, so NEPA. And many regard this as the main event that shaped the first tool for environmental management, which is the Environmental Impact Assessment, or the EIA. NEPA aimed to support decision-making by listing and assessing the potential environmental consequences of a proposed activity and using this EIA as an instrument. NEPA is seen as an important departure from the traditional expansionist economic view of the world with unlimited resources, whereas NEPA realizes that natural resources are finite. So this was a major shift in thinking. During this decade, EIA and other assessment tools were refined, but they were all generally used to assess specific impacts of actions. For example, the impact on air quality from a new factory, or the impact on water resources, or the impact on soils due to some agricultural method, etc. During the second decade, the 1980s to 1990, there was a growing emphasis on effective stakeholder engagement and instilling conflict resolution into the EIA process. Furthermore, it became apparent to be very cognizant of the social context during the EIA process and the need to integrate social issues and societal values into its assessments. And here you can refer back to lectures slides 1 and 2, where we looked at values and decision making and the self in the environment. During this decade, scoping is introduced as a method to identify and focus the EIA on key environmental issues. And you will see we go more into scoping as a step in our EIA process in the next set of slides, and next is slide 6. The EIA is then quickly adopted as a credible tool for environmental management across the developed world. During the 1990s, the popularity of EIA in environmental management coincided with the rise of other major concepts and events, such as sustainable development, as we have covered in lectures before. This then led to a renewed and continued focus on environmental assessment and management approaches as tools to reverse, slow, stop, or mitigate the implications of unsustainable development on humans and nature. New tools emerge as a result, such as strategic environmental assessments and the concept of environmental justice to address wider societal and political issues. Here is a table that neatly summarizes this global evolution of integrated environmental management over these 3 decades. Okay. In this section, we're going to look at the evolution of environmental management in South Africa. So, environmental governance pre-1992 was very fragmented in our country. During apartheid, the focus was on particular environmental aspects, for example, conservation and water infrastructure. But the environmental policies at the time were formulated and implemented to perpetuate inequality, whereas it restricted access to natural resources and to advance the white minority. These policies also largely ignored sustainability and to the greater benefit of the environment. Marginalized communities often bore the brunt of environmental pollution due to the strategic placement of polluting land uses such as mine dumps, power plants, industries, etc., next to residential areas assigned for Black communities. I mean, you guys know the spatial architecture of apartheid cities and how industries were used as physical and spatial barriers to separate groups. The negative health impacts are still evident in these communities. Hammond, Booth, and O'Royden described the essence of the apartheid environmental policies as follows, and I read, I quote, "Environmental policies of the pre-1994 government were white-dominated, deeply unjust for the poor and the dispossessed, and programmed to maintain inequality and powerlessness. Ngobise and Kok point out that many conservation projects in the past disregarded human needs, rights, or dignity, and that frequently conservation meant dispossession. For instance, the establishment of game reserves meant forced removal and dislocation for many people. As Khan maintains, one of the intangible yet important environmental legacies of apartheid is the deep distrust felt by the majority of Black people towards environmental conservation engendered by such forced removals. Compared to what was happening elsewhere in the world, South Africa was slow to develop and introduce formal procedures for environmental assessments. Soman et al. Identify a number of factors that were at play at the time. They note that there was a lack of political will at the time, a lack of accountability by decision makers, inadequate public participation, inefficient legislation and administrative structures, a lack of awareness of the need to consider environmental issues to begin with. Further, there was a lack of public support for environmental protection. And again, we can relate this back to what we noted in the previous slide, is that Soman also agrees that it was understandable, this lack of public support, given the country's previous environmental practices and laws, which was enforced by colonialism and apartheid, which alienated Black people from their traditional role as guardians of the land. The South African government at the time experienced significant international pressure to improve environmental governance. The benefit of EIA was deliberated within our context over a number of years. And during the 1980s, voluntary EIAs were often called for when controversial development proposals were assessed. But it wasn't legislated yet as a mandatory action. But it was only made a legal requirement when the Environmental Conservation Act, or the ECA, was assented in 1989. The law stipulated that environmental policy and environmental impact reports must guide decision making. This act laid the basis for Integrated Environmental Management, or IEM, which is the underlying philosophy or framework and set of principles applicable to the South African context. IEM still forms the basis of environmental management in South Africa today, and we will discuss this framework in more detail later on. The Constitution of the Republic of South Africa was ratified in 1996, shortly after the abolishment of the old regime in 1994. It is the supreme law of the country, and the Bill of Rights is contained in Chapter 2. The environmental right, Section 24, is enshrined in this chapter, and it reads as follows. Everyone has the right, A, to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, and B, to have the environment protected for the benefit of present and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that I, prevent pollution and ecological degradation, promote conservation, and secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources while promoting justifiable economic and social development. This is very key to the essence of environmental management. The ratification of the Constitution meant that the ECA, the Environmental Conservation Act, was misaligned in parts with this highest law of the land. To rectify this, the Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism, so it was DEET at the time, initiated a broad-reaching participatory process known as the Consultative National Environmental Policy Process. This process ultimately laid the foundation for the formulation of the current National Environmental Management Act of 1998. We now come to the part of the presentation where we will look at Integrated Environmental Management, or IEM. Just on a side note first, the document by DEET on this topic is very important. The 2004 document, as well as Soman et al., and then also van der Bijl, which looks at environmental management over the last 20 years. Okay, so initially, IEM was seen as a procedure that would ensure that the potential environmental impacts of proposals are scrutinized and considered when decisions are made on these proposals. In this light, the aim of IEM was to reconcile conflicting interests and concerns and improve proposals by minimizing negative impacts and enhancing positive aspects. Okay, this view very much saw IEM as what we now know the role of the EIA is, which is an environmental management tool or an instrument. Okay. However, over time, this concept has evolved to be an underlying philosophy and set of principles supported by a range of environmental assessment and management tools that are aimed at promoting sustainability. So it started off as describing and being the same as the EIA, which is a tool, an environmental management tool, but then it grew into something a bit more holistic, as the sort of framework, a way of thinking, a set of principles that we now have as our underlying base in NEMA. And then this framework contains a whole set of environmental management tools, as I will highlight in the next slides. Just to reiterate then, IEM is now a way of thinking and no longer just a procedural requirement or tool. The Department of Environmental Affairs and Tourism now offers the following definition of IEM. IEM provides a holistic framework that can be embraced by all sectors of society for the assessment and management of environmental impacts and aspects associated with an activity for each stage of an activity life cycle, taking in consideration a broad definition of environment and with the overall aim of promoting sustainable development. Integrating environmental management as this way of thinking has been completely and utterly embodied in NEMA. The whole chapter 5 is dedicated to integrated environmental management in NEMA, and these I've just given you here an extract of what the Act says, what the objective of integrated environmental management is, and you can work through these in your own time. The next 4 or 5 slides will focus on 19 overarching IEM principles as outlined by DEET. Just to note is that when DEET came up with and formulated these principles, it was based on a very detailed review and synthesis of relevant principles for environmental policy and environmental assessment worldwide. These included the 1992 IEM principles, our own NEMA principles, which we'll touch on in Lecture 6, and principles from the International Association of Impact Assessments. I'm not going to go through each of these, but as you can see, the column is very straightforward in that it lists the principle and then it describes it. So on this particular slide, I'm only going to touch on the first one, which is the principle of accountability and responsibility. And here we note that the accountability and responsibility of all stakeholders in the process should be clarified for each stage of the activity's life cycle. On this slide, I would like to pause on the principle of community empowerment, which I think is very pertinent for our South African context, given what we discussed on previous slides of a lack of public support when it comes to environmental protection, understandably because of our colonial and apartheid histories. So this principle then calls for community well-being and empowerment to be promoted through knowledge sharing and awareness raising programs in order to build the capacity of people to participate effectively and to manage the environment themselves. Here, let's look at principle number 8, which is equity. Okay, this links back to our natural resource lecture. So, equitable access should be provided to environmental resources, benefits, and services to meet basic human needs and to promote human well-being for both present and future generations. So, again, natural resources, ecosystem services, etc., all comes into these principles. And let's look at number 11, informed decision making. The most appropriate methods and techniques must be applied responsibly and rigorously to address issues that really matter, and so provide sound and useful information for decision makers. We will get to when we get to the EIA process, you'll understand why this baseline information and quality of baseline information is very important in making informed decisions. On this slide, I want to touch on principles 14 and 15, which you'll hear about a lot. We'll come across it a lot, which is 14 is the polluter pays principle. So this means that the cost of remedying pollution, environmental degradation, and consequent adverse health effects, and of preventing, controlling, or minimizing further pollution, environmental damage, or adverse health effects must be paid for by those primarily responsible for causing these effects. So, for example, an oil spill on a coastline, the oil drilling company, whether it be Shell or any of those bigger sort of names, they should not only pay for the cleanup of an oil spill, but also make sure that there's systems in place and pay for these systems that future spills will be eliminated or prevented. Okay, and then principle 15, the precautionary approach. So this is also a very important one that you'll come across a lot. Okay, so this means to adopt a risk-averse and cautious approach, in particularly where current knowledge is limited, and link this approach to a commitment to continuous improvement. So it basically means always err on the side of caution, right, when it comes to environmental decision making. On this last slide of the IEM principles, let's just look at transparency, which is principle 19, and which is sort of self-explanatory, but it means decisions must be taken in an open and transparent manner, and access to information must be provided in accordance with the law. And you'll see in the formative assessment that I've set up for the end of this lecture, I ask you guys to go and read a minister's decision on that very complex City of Cape Town Regional Landfill Site EIA that we spoke about before. And here you'll see, and you'll have to assess it yourself, whether he was transparent or as transparent as he could be. We've looked at the principles of IEM, and now we look at the tools or the instruments. Right, so the principles provided above can be realized through using one or more environmental management tools or instruments, which are then used by a specialist to support decision making. Popular tools that we sort of all know about by now is environmental impact assessments or EIAs, or strategic environmental assessments, SEAs, and environmental management frameworks, EMFs. But there are a whole lot more. So DEED identifies many more. So let's look at them. Again, I'm not going to look at them all in detail. I expect you to read through them and understand when and why each one of these will be used or can be used. Okay, firstly, to screening, what screening means. It determines whether or not a development proposal requires environmental assessment in the first place. You'll see it's actually scoping. Screening is the first step to the regulated EIA process in NEMA, but we'll get to that as well. Then there is the environmental impact assessment, which is very popular or very well known. Then there's stakeholder engagement as a tool, and then there's the life cycle assessment as well. So I particularly like life cycle assessments, and I think in future we might rely on these a lot more. It is a tool for the systematic analysis and evaluation of the environmental aspects of a product or service through all stages of its life. So again, it links back to what we spoke about in natural resource use, where we're trying to change the linear life cycle of a resource, where it comes from earth, it's mined, used throughout its life, and then discarded as waste. We try and change that into a circular, recycled life cycle. So LCA, as it's called for short, considers all the inputs, so raw energy, raw materials, water, etc., and all the outputs, which is the products, the byproducts, the services. It could be done from a specific company or organization, or for a wider industry. So, for example, looking at the entire steel manufacturing industry as a whole, or a sector as a whole. And then we can look at environmental auditing or environmental accounting, technology assessments, cumulative effects assessment, which is an interesting one as well. So this one requires a systematic procedure for identifying and evaluating the significance of effects from multiple actions, representing potential causes of impacts. And then there's the cost-benefit analysis, which we already spoke about in lecture 2. To continue, another integrated environmental management tool is environmental economics, and here you'll recall that we touched on it in lecture slide 3 when you look at resource economics. And this approach helps identify the costs and benefits, negative and positive, environmental impacts, and that is not necessarily always taken into account by economic agents. And then there's ecological and environmental footprinting, which I'm sure you are aware of, and risks assessments. Another well-used or popular environmental management tool is state of the environment reporting. This is done on different levels and scales, from a national state of the environment report to provincial reports to municipal reports. For example, the Western Cape's latest State of the Environment report was dated 2018, and that reflects or tries to take a snapshot of the environment over a 3-year period between 2014 and 2017. The report highlights about 9 themes, environmental themes, and then they predict or present an outlook based on the assessment of these themes. And these are categorized either as improving, declining, or stable. For example, in the latest Western Cape report, when they look at biodiversity and ecosystem health, the outlook is declining. For coasts, the outlook is declining. For human settlements, the outlook is stable. For air quality, interesting enough, there's the state is presented as improving, and you get the idea. And then another tool is the C, or the Strategic Environmental Assessment, which is also a very well-used tool, widely used tool for determining the environmental implications of decisions made at a policy, plan, or program level. Okay, so by focusing on the high-level processes, the C complements and provides a framework for project-level EIAs. For example, where I live in the far south, beyond Kaapstad in Cape Town, we fall under the Southern District for the city of Cape Town, and the district plan, the spatial development, is the local area plan. So the city of Cape Town realize that there's a lot of environmental pressures, or the development and environmental pressures in the area needs to be looked at. So they appointed CSRR to look at the district plan, the Southern District Plan, especially for the far south. So it's a policy, and to then come up with a sustainability framework around it, to say So basically assessing it, the environment, highlighting where there's environmental sensitivities, identify areas where development can occur, etc. And this is on the strategic level. So this is very proactive environmental planning. And then site level EIAs would then consult the C to understand what is the broader view and the broader sensitivities in the area. On this slide, I'll just briefly touch on the environmental management plan. Environmental management plan is a very detailed plan to manage an activity during construction, implementation, operations, etc. of the development or the human activity. So it's quite specific to the actual activity. For example, once you receive an environmental authorization for a certain development, the decision-making authority can call for an EMP as part of their conditions of approval. For example, an EMP can cover things like rehabilitation of disturbed vegetation during construction and after. It could cover things like if there's fauna in the area, it can come up with a plan of how to search and find the fauna and to remove it and put it in a suitable location, etc. You might wonder how one then choose which tool to use for which environmental situation. You'll see this diagram from the developed by Deed is very handy in that it shows us that tool selection depends on whether the instrument is needed at a strategic level, so that is a plan, a program, or policy, or at a project level when it's site specific. It furthermore depends on what stage of the environmental management process the tool is required. Is it required at the beginning of the process, the planning phase, or the scoping phase, or during the established phase, so when the development or activity has been implemented, it's operational, etc. In the following slides, we'll look at some examples of how these tools align with this diagram. You'll see on the top axis, on the top left axis, we have strategic level, and then on the bottom left you have project level, and then you have these quadrants. So the top left quadrant is when is at the planning stage, when you identify issues and you're looking at options. So that's where a strategic environmental assessment is very handy, and also scenario analysis. Then when you move to the right, top right, this is when you start evaluating and monitoring. Then you can use something like a sustainability analysis tool, footprinting, or life cycle analysis. So then when you go down to the project level and the bottom left, this is when you look at the planning and the design phase on a site. So it's a site-specific project. Then you can look at EIA or screening, or even a cost-benefit analysis. And then the last one is when the project or the activity has been implemented. You're still on a project level, so site-specific. So it's established. It's either construction or operational phase, or even closure. Then you will look at using a tool such as footprinting, again a life cycle analysis, or even sustainability reporting, to then take a snapshot of what the activity is actually impacting on. The first example of applied IEM tool is the environmental management framework, and this is a real example of the EMF for the Greater Saldanha area, which was completed in 2017. It was done for the entire municipality, as you can see for the map. It was done at a strategic level and at an issue identification and option stage. So you'll see from the deeds diagram, the quadrant, decision-making criteria, you'll see it's strategic, issue identification, so it's top left quadrant. Because this is trying to ascertain which elements of the environment should be no-go areas, where there's overlapping issues, and then thus greater sensitivities, and where potential development can occur. The following two is the C, and the specific C is the one I've already mentioned for the far south, which is where I live. And this was issued by the City of Cape Town and prepared by the CSIR. And it again is on a strategic level. The scale is a sub-district within a metro municipality, and it's also at the beginning phase, so it's when you identify issues within a greater area. So this document actually stipulates here their understanding of a C, and they note that there are numerous approaches to C that have been developed internationally, each reflecting a different understanding of its intended purpose. The South African Strategic Environmental Assessment Guideline defines C as a process that integrates sustainability considerations into the formulation, assessment, and implementation of policies, plans, and programs. So this C is now often used as this overarching go-to document where developers, consultants, environmental practitioners all can go and see where the environmental no-goes zones are. The third example is an environmental impact assessment, but it's not the full-blown EIA, it's the mini EIA called the basic assessment. This is at a project level, site-specific, right? So this is an EIA that is, or basic assessment that's been done and ongoing at the moment for the proposed construction of a school on a vacant piece or greenfields in the suburb of Noordhoek. This process triggered, or the proposal triggered a basic assessment due to seasonal wetlands on the property. Okay, so it's very site specific. It's not strategic at all. It's project specific, and it's at the planning and design phase. So that's why if you look again in the quadrant block, you'll see it's the bottom left quadrant that is applicable here. The fourth tool that I would like to highlight is the life cycle assessment. Again, when we look at our four quadrants, you can see that this life cycle assessment of an urban water cycle in the eThekwini municipality is very site specific. But it is not at the planning and design phase because it's looking at the provisioning of water to industries in the area. So it's already established phase. It's an operational service that is now evaluated to see what is the environmental effects of either provisioning normal potable water versus recycled water to industries. And very interestingly, this article shows that recycled water has a far lesser environmental impact than provisioning normal potable water to these industries. The last example of an environmental management tool is that of an environmental management plan, or an EMP. And this specific example is for construction activities at a certain site within a national park in Cape Town. Okay, so again, if we look at our four quadrants, it is again project level, site specific, and it is specifically written to guide construction within a national park. So it's at the construction established phase. Okay. Yeah, and I mean, you can see here their definition of environmental plan is a plan or program that seeks to achieve a required end state and describes how activities that have or could have an adverse effect on the environment will be mitigated, controlled, and monitored. Okay. This brings me to the end of this lecture. And to consolidate everything that we've learned, the following formative assessment must now be looked at. You will remember that we looked at the City of Cape Town's regional landfill site, or the EIA for the proposed landfill site, in lectures 2, and we did that class role-play exercise, the dialogue and values. And during that, it became very apparent that different interest groups nurture different values, be it environmental values, health, financial, transparency, equity, fairness, etc., which in turn influence their differing viewpoints on the merits of a proposal. So what I'm asking you now is to have a look at the reasons given by Minister Pradal, who is the Minister of the Western Cape Government, Minister of Environmental, DEDP, so Department of Environmental Affairs and Development Planning, which is attached and available on Blackboard, where he gives a detailed account of how he arrived at his decision. So now I'm asking you to use the general EIM principles that we discussed here in this lecture, the 19 principles, as a lens or framework to assess how these principles guided the minister in making his decision. Okay. Furthermore, I urge you to see if you can identify or surmise which values he favored in making this decision. Was it environmental justice, equity, health, etc.? Please present this in a 1 to 2 page document. Thank you.